Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, the 21st of March, 2023, for the very first webinar in our series for 2023 for the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm one of the co-founders and directors of NENA, and I'm your facilitator tonight. I'd like to acknowledge country, and as has become a rather nice Zoom tradition, if you'd like to write into the chat whose country you're on or where you're from, or say hello, that would be really nice. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in beautiful North Brisbane. The New Economy Network Australia wants to acknowledge that country was never ceded, that prior to British imperialism, this continent was governed by hundreds of First Nations groups, and we want to acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation. The work that we do in the new economy space very much owes a debt in this continent to the remarkable governance system that Aboriginal peoples had in place, and which still inspires and really guides a lot of the work we do in NENA. So we want to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging young leaders and elders. And there's someone here saying hello from Germany. That's exciting. Hello, and hello to all of you. So tonight I'm really excited to be introducing our three speakers. But before I do that, just a quick blurb about the New Economy Network Australia. We're a network of individuals and organisations all around Australia. We're 6 or 7 years old, run entirely by volunteers. A really amazing group of people have been building NENA for many years. And I see a lot of names in here tonight, people who've been part of NENA for a long time. We run events and sharings and projects and special weeks of webinars and activities. We also run a now biennial conference, and I urge all of you to have a look at the website. The conference in November in Canberra is going to be a ripper because it's been a couple of years since we all got together, and we're really excited to have an in-person conference. And the theme is challenging. It's called Life After Capitalism ? So it'll look at all of the emerging economic paradigms like well-being economics, as well as some of the older established ideas around steady state economics and ecological economics. And it's with the ecological economics and steady state economics in mind that I'm really delighted to introduce our three speakers tonight, Martin Tighe, Jane O'Sullivan and Craig Parker. I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit in their talks. They're each going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A. If anyone would like to ask a question, please do write it in the chat at any time. I'll collate them and we'll work our way through them or try to group them into themes when we get to the Q&A. And as always, if you could stay on mute, that would be terrific. But without anything further from me, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, or welcome Martin Tighe. How are you this evening, Martin?
I'm well, thank you.
That's good. Good to see you. You're now going to have the spotlight, and I'll gently interrupt you if I need to when your time is coming to the close. So thank you so much. And over to you, Martin.
Okay, so my little piece is entitled Doing Degrowth. So I'll start reading right now. To view the world through the degrowth lens is like being freed from a prison of the mind, constrained by the shackles formed by narrowly focusing so much of our energy and creativity on the mindless pursuit of endless economic growth, and of constantly dealing with the growing burdens which attend that hollow, futile quest. Once the degrowth enlightenment is embraced, a whole new broad spectrum world opens up like a magnificent rainbow. So many new goals, so many new options, a world of social, ecological, and economic progress. Our work newly defined, our work newly measured in this new world of limitless possibilities. But we've all been brought up in the endless growth narrative, a story where bigger is always better. Bigger populations equal bigger markets, equals bigger consumption, equals bigger profits, which supposedly trickle down to benefit all, so the story goes. Of course, a complete crock of shit. We're bombarded daily with a continual flood of growthist propaganda via news feeds, advertising, and political rhetoric, sponsored by those whose ill-gotten gains are founded on a short-sighted, planet-crushing economic ideology. Suggestions that there may be a better way to think, a better way to live, and a better economic system for organising our affairs are quickly ridiculed and discredited by business as usual interests. There is no other way, we're told. Growth is good. GDP to measure how big the economy is. It's the only performance indicator we need. And so long as GDP is growing, the world is a happy place. Growth, growth, growth is the neoliberal economist's wet dream. Such shallowness, such ignorance, such short-sighted greed. There is no such thing as ecological limits or resource constraints, as the infinite earth ideology prevails. No place for nature in a world where land and other life forms are treated as nothing more than an economic input or a receptacle for our ever-growing wastes. Theirs is a world where people who slip through the ever-widening cracks can remain unmeasured, unaccounted for, and largely unreported. People and nature far too easily ignored when naught but the profit motive guides actions. Economic growth has now become an almost cult-like end in itself, rather than a means to an end. The ends remain blurry, undefined, or where stated, but economic growth fails to deliver, simply hushed up and brushed over with a future promise of better times ahead. Our problem, of course, was that we were not expanding the human economy fast enough. It makes me laugh. It's just so ridiculous. Sorry, I read this and I just go, how stupid were we? So now I've got to find my place again because it's hard for me to read this stuff. We weren't expanding the economy quickly enough. Never considered is the idea that growth itself was the problem. So growth itself is now our preoccupation. And when the fact that the system's on the verge of collapse starts to become obvious to those outside the immediate economic growth, cash benefit bubble, the vested interests simply ramp up the growthism propaganda to muddy the waters, to confuse, to present flawed economic solutions, anything to ensure that the growth paradigm is never questioned, and the majority turn a blind eye to the reality of system failure and continue to buy into growth with both minds and wallets. Our challenge in the degrowth movement is to win over the hearts and minds of the majority, to get them to believe and to act. Our goal is to force economic system change. We need people to understand the degrowth vision for a better world, what our aims are, how we can achieve them, and why this is a far, far better path. We must make people believe that this change is possible, not only possible, but absolutely necessary if we are to survive and prosper far into a new future. Yes, there is an alternative way of being, an alternative way of organising our affairs, and that alternative is via the degrowth path. Degrowth is about guiding us from this dangerous, volatile, destructive state of overshoot forward towards sustainable scale, whereupon we can settle into a dynamic state of balance organised under what is known as the steady state economy. So let's talk more about degrowth. To many, the word degrowth sounds scary, so let's clear that up. Degrowth is not an uncontrolled collapse, as some may imagine, with job losses, hunger, and social chaos. That's what happens when you reach the end phase after attempting endless growth on a finite planet. That is collapse, and it is a very different thing. No, degrowth is simply the economics term for a careful, planned reduction in the scale and impact of the human economy. Degrowth is the process of finding balance, harmony, resilience, and sustainable scale as a powerful platform from which to pursue genuine progress across a broad spectrum of social, ecological, and economic fields. Sustainable scale is that position whereby population, lifestyles, and technology interact dynamically, safely within the limits of the lands we occupy to drive positive outcomes for all. That state is where degrowth aims to take us. You can think of it as degrowth for regrowth, if that helps. Degrowth is the only context that will facilitate genuine sustainability. The big mistake of our times is to believe we can do sustainability within a fundamentally unsustainable system. The green growth idea only serves to perpetuate a dangerous status quo and lock in collapse. Our choice is not one between continuance of a viable system, which just needs a few green tweaks and change. Our choice is between sitting mindlessly on a sinking ship or boarding the degrowth lifeboat. Degrowth must be considered in the lifeboat context, not in the why leave a happy ship context. It's time to scale back and to do so in an orderly, planned, and managed way. So, what is the purpose of degrowth? It's important to consider that degrowth is not a process without end, just a means to bring us back to sustainable scale, whereupon steady state economics can be applied to keep us safe, productive, and secure for countless generations to come. The economic steady state is about accepting that there are limits to the pressures we should place on the land and not exceeding them, thus providing a long-term operating base within which to plan, organise, and seek genuine progress. Degrowth is a phase. The steady state economy is the forever. I'm hoping a degrowth vision is starting to form out of the mist. All great movements are founded on a clear vision. Now for the passion. I really want you to become as absolutely passionate about this vision as I am. We are up against very powerful interests. Only passion will overcome them. Better still, convert them. There can be no half measures in a social movement for change. History teaches us that. The degrowth movement is founded on 4 principles. 1, the economy is the foundation of society. It therefore must be resilient, strong, equitable, and most importantly, sustainable over the long term. 2, the environment is the foundation of the economy. An economy which is degrading the environment is undermining itself and therefore doomed to fail. 3, the environment is finite and sets limits to the scale of the human economy. It really is just common sense, but a notion rejected by those blinded to externalities by the short-term profit motive, those for whom economic growth is a best fit. And lastly, and maybe the absolute key, number 4, environmental limits must never be breached. To do so is to steal from our children, from other life, and is a disgusting, unethical, intergenerational crime of the worst kind. If these 4 points resonate with you, if you understand how fundamentally crucial they are, if you're willing to embrace them, then you're ready for the degrowth movement. Degrowth is both a vision and a mission. It's a commitment. It's a discipline. Success never comes easy. Solving all problems begin by recognizing that you have a problem. Economic growth is the problem, so it stands to reason that degrowth is the solution. So for now, I just ask you to accept the need, in theory, for the degrowth to steady state mission. Don't be put off by the "but how can we do it" question. Just allow the idea to sink in. The how do we do it will be the subject of Craig and Jane's presentation, which follows. But when listening to them, please don't be easily put off. Accepting a new paradigm involves some significant mental adjustments. Some ideas may seem far from your established version of reality. But one thing I can promise you, the challenges of doing degrowth are small compared to the impossibility of sustaining endless growth. So now just one last thing before I go. I'm going to ask you to imagine something for me. I'd like you to imagine that future day when it is declared that degrowth has done its job, that we as a global set of nations, through mutual cooperation and determination, have achieved sustainable scale. Imagine that future point in time when we can all pause and enjoy a rich sense of achievement, immense satisfaction and pride in a work job well done. Imagine the day when we are no longer future eating, when the earth, nature, wildlife, forests, rivers, oceans, people are healing, when the anvil of economic growth has been lifted from our planet, cast into the failed experiment bin. Enjoy that feeling. Imagine knowing that you were part of that movement, your work etched in time. You were a degrowther, an influencer of change. Stand on top of a mountain, take a deep breath of clean air, smell the flowers, listen to the bees, gaze into the distance, and know that 7 generations from now, our families will all be able to do the same. Mission accomplished, Earth saved, future ensured, and you were involved. How good will that day be? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Very thoughtful words. And I've got some questions of my own about the connection between degrowth and some of the more modern manifestations of steady state, like donut economics, but let's come back to them shortly. So now I'd like to invite Jane O'Sullivan, a regular member and a presenter for NENA, to share with us a discussion about population. And then we'll go to Craig to be connecting some of these concepts into some other thinking. So thank you again, Martin. And over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Michelle. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Great. So my contribution is going to be about population stabilisation or decline. And I work on this particular issue with Sustainable Population Australia, which is an environmental NGO working throughout Australia. And I'm very happy to be sharing this panel with Craig and Martin, who are doing such good work to shift the dial on economic thinking. Oops, I've just got to go to my presentation so I can control it. My big frustration with ecological economists in general is that they usually don't consider population growth as part of their thinking and analysis. And they're not thinking about how it governs a lot of the negative trends that they'd like to turn around. Many dismiss it angrily with that it's a distraction from the social reforms that we need. Their reasoning appears to be that population growth is only happening in poor countries, so drawing attention to it is deflecting attention from the excesses of the rich, and that populationists are hence seen as being against equality and social justice, defending the rich and paying out on the poor. This is so profoundly wrong-headed that it makes me despair. I started working on population because I saw how strongly it impoverishes families and communities. There's no hope of eradicating poverty in countries growing at 2 or 3% per year. Anyone who hopes to close the gap between rich and poor should recognise that ending population growth is an absolute prerequisite. So our primary motivations need to be around food and water security, economic betterment, women's health rights and empowerment, peace and stable governments, and climate change adaptation, which are all threatened by population growth. But stabilising population is nevertheless essential to end biodiversity loss, keep global warming below 2 degrees, and restore sustainable resource use. But pursuing those ends doesn't mean that we're neglecting the interests of poor people. It means that we're trying to save them. I sometimes get accused of racism for including pictures of dark-skinned people on my slides. And I do this work because I care deeply about the people of sub-Saharan Africa and achieving a better future for them. But I also care deeply about Australia, its natural environment, and how it could be an example to the world in modelling sustainable economic management, if only we gave up on population growth. The latest State of the Environment report clearly emphasises that population growth contributes to all of the pressures in this report. Australia's population growth is very high by world standards. It's higher than global population growth rate. It's higher than most poor countries. So it's certainly untrue that population growth only relates to poor countries. And this high growth rate was ramped up rather sharply from around 2005 in a bipartisan push by both coalition and Labor governments. You might remember Peter Costello and his one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country, it pushed to have more babies. The population taboo is particularly frustrating because the people who think that they're denouncing populationists for the sake of social justice are working directly into the hands of the rich and powerful, who are the architects of policies to boost population growth. They know that suppressing wages is the best way to keep their profits up, and flooding the labour market with job seekers is the best way to suppress wages. They know that the easiest money to be made is by rezoning land for housing development, and you need population growth to generate demand for new housing estates. They know that to grow the economy, we have to put more money into it, so we need more people to take on bigger mortgages to keep blowing up this bubble economy. So let's address some of the myths that make people think that we shouldn't talk about population. Firstly, there's the idea that there's nothing ethical we can do about population growth, and it's already stopping by itself, so why draw attention to it? Well, the current projections actually cover quite a wide range of possible futures. And this chart shows the UN's projections, with the shaded area being their estimate of the probable range. And the dashed lines are scenarios used by the IPCC in climate mitigation modelling. And you should note that all of the successful climate scenarios use SSP1 or SSP2, which are way below the UN's probability range, and therefore would require strong proactive interventions to make them happen. Without that, it's not possible to limit global warming below 2 degrees, no matter how good we are at implementing other strategies around renewable energy, etc. Some people say the UN is being too pessimistic in their projection, and they choose to believe the IPCC's projection, but wishing won't make it true. Let's look at how the UN's projection has been shaping up against reality. The UN revises its population estimates every 2 or 3 years. And in this chart, the black diamonds show the UN's estimate of the world population at the time that they released each of their recent releases. So the blue dashed lines are the UN's projections starting from each of those dates. And you can see that each of these projections has underestimated the population that was reported in the next UN release. So if we accept the pink line joining up each of the UN's estimates of the current population as being a best estimate of the path we're actually on, growth has been running at about 90 million people per year. To me, this is a wake-up call. We can't afford to be complacent about population growth. So then people say population growth is due to poverty. Development is the best contraceptive. So why don't you just shut up about it and work to relieve poverty? The truth is that fertility decline has not depended on getting richer. It has depended on countries running good family planning programs. And the left-hand chart shows that there's been no relationship at all between the amount of fertility decline and the level of wealth countries have. The next chart shows that countries with high fertility simply haven't been able to get out of poverty. Once fertility gets below 3, countries start to get ahead, and when it's below the replacement level of 2.1, development really took off. And this is understandable since population growth diverts a lot of investment and effort just to try and provide enough infrastructure and new teachers and doctors and everything else to expand everything at 2 or 3% per year. Most poor countries simply can't keep up. It's like trying to run up a down escalator. If the escalator is going too fast, you end up going backwards. But if you can just slow it down a bit, you start to make headway. The slower it goes, the more benefit you get for the same amount of effort. So it's not just about whether a country is overpopulated. Even if it still has a lot of natural resources, its growth rate is a big drag on progress. And this applies to Australia just as it applies to Nigeria. But of course, in the economy to save us, we're not looking for GDP growth in a country like Australia. We need much lower levels of energy and resource consumption. And that becomes much easier if the population is also declining, so that the smaller pie is being shared by fewer people. This isn't an excuse for keeping per capita consumption up. It means that whatever per capita reductions we can achieve add up to a greater reduction overall. So this is critically important if we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, because we simply can't roll out renewables fast enough if our total energy demand stays where it is, let alone increases with population. Building renewable energy infrastructure requires a lot of energy itself. So the faster we build out, the more we have to cut back on other energy to prevent emissions going up. Lowering population also means lower emissions per person, not just in total, because the construction industry is particularly energy and resource intensive. So the less we need to build to accommodate more people, the lower our per capita emissions footprint. We also know that a tighter labour market means higher wages and workers get a better share of the economic pie. Profits to capital have been getting a bigger share for decades, and population decline would start to turn that around. It's largely why the rich and powerful try to make us so scared about population ageing, because they want to keep their profits up by keeping wages low. Ageing is not a threat. It does not reduce the number of workers. It just means fewer are unemployed. Then there's the benefits for housing affordability and the opportunities for rewilding and for producing food in less industrialised ways that are kinder to the environment and to animals. Some people think that the idea of population growth causing social ills is some misguided notion of Thomas Malthus, which Malthusians blindly accept. Malthus really didn't contribute much new in this area. The link between population growth, poverty, and inequality between workers and owners of capital was well understood for centuries before. Aristotle wrote about the need for population control to ensure citizens could live a good life and that the means of subsistence were not divided too finely amongst too many people. Adam Smith identified population growth as the only mechanism by which rising wages would not eat up the profits of capital. Karl Marx talked about industrialists' need for a reserve army of unemployed people to keep wages low and workers compliant. And because of globalization, population growth doesn't have to be happening here for it to have some impact on wages. Shifting jobs to low-wage countries has undermined the bargaining power of Australian workers. Housing affordability is a contentious issue, and many people who refuse to see population growth as a problem like to blame it on constraints to land releases or too much red tape in government regulation of housing development. But the property industry is very clear about it. They tell international investors that our population growth will ensure future capital gains, and they pour millions of dollars into political lobbying for high immigration. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and Australia and Canada, the developed countries with the highest population growth, have shot to the top of housing unaffordability stakes and household debt levels. Australia used to be among the countries with the most affordable housing and high home ownership, and we're now among the bottom of the pile. And I recently saw this quote in an article from Japan. In Japan, houses are like cars. As soon as you move in, the new home is worth less than what you paid for it, and after you've finished paying it off your mortgage in 40 years, it's worth almost nothing. He's exaggerating, but there it is. Japan has a declining population and gradually improving housing affordability. So as far as I see it, ending population growth and allowing it to decline gradually is sustainability's low-hanging fruit. It's not just something that we know we ultimately need, but it's going to happen anyway, so we don't need to do anything about it. It can be a powerful lever to set off a virtuous cycle, reinforcing all the trends towards sustainable prosperity. And it's important to recognise that it doesn't compete with reducing consumption per person or implementing greener technologies. It costs next to nothing, and it releases resources for those other activities. For instance, if we don't need to build as many schools and hospitals, we can build more renewable energy capacity and retrofit more homes to save energy. Also, people often say shifting the population path is too slow. This is not entirely true. A lot of the impacts come from the population growth rate, which we can rapidly change. But it does take a long time to make a difference to the actual population and its resource needs. That's not a reason to neglect it. It makes it all the more urgent, so we don't further delay the time when those big dividends roll in. So finally, a quick summary of Sustainable Population Australia's position on population policy. We advocate capping net immigration at around 60,000 per year. And this is a level that will let our growth taper off over the next couple of decades. It still allows at least as many refugees as we currently take. Currently, the quota is a bit under 14,000, and we could lift it to, say, 20,000 per year. And it still means employers can recruit from overseas if they really can't find the right people in Australia. But we believe all skilled migrants should have a job to go to. This is what most other countries do or used to do. If you want to go and work in another country, you need an employer to sponsor your visa application. We think it's a good thing if those migrant workers have pathways to become permanent residents if they want it. But we shouldn't be handing out permanent residence visas like candy to people who don't have jobs to go to, which is what we do currently. We're less worried about the family reunion intake because that will naturally fall if the intake of skilled migrants is also lower. And there are also policies that affect birth rates. We're against pronatalist policies that seek to entice people to have more kids. And we'd like to see better access to contraception and abortion services for women everywhere, including in rural Australia, where it's still quite difficult for many women to access, and overseas through foreign aid. And a quick plug for Sustainable Population Australia's discussion papers that you can download from the website and that give more detail on all of these issues. So I'll just finish with a quote from Paul Ehrlich: "Whatever your cause, it's a lost cause without population control." Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane. And right on time as well. Getting some great questions coming in, so that's terrific. We'll run through them shortly. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Craig Parker, who I will bring onto the spotlight. Craig, thanks for being the last speaker and working to bring it all together. So we'll hand over to you now, whenever you're ready to share screen.
No worries. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Got my screen?
Loud and clear. Yep, and we can see your slides as well. It's all good.
All right, very good. No pressure on me. I've just got to bring this all together. Thanks, Martin and Jane. Always love listening to you guys talk. So my job here is to talk about the current economic system and how we transition to an economic system that's sustainable and can provide standards of living for generations to come. Obviously, the current economic system is somewhat suicidal because it's completely dependent on our planet's natural capital, yet as Martin alluded to, that is finite. And the problem is it's also very dependent on the very extraction, destruction and pollution of that natural capital that it is dependent upon. Now, the problem we've got is, as Martin alluded to as well, the economists and politicians, they love to put the fear into us. And, you know, if they talk about any sort of economic change, they're like, oh no, you're going to lose your jobs. You're not going to be able to buy a house. Your house prices will fall over. You're not going to be able to retire because you won't be able to create wealth. There'll be no markets. Lie, 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 because there is another economic system that we know that we can transition to. We've just got to get the message out to the general public. The general public need to know how we're going to do it. They want to know a little bit more about the nuts and bolts, and that's what I'm going to try and get through tonight as fast as we can, because we want to get to the Q&A. Firstly, I'd like to say I'm not so arrogant or presumptuous to assume that I know everything and that I have all the answers, but the important thing is we shouldn't let that stop us from moving forward, because as Martin suggested, we're pretty much heading for a great big iceberg and we need a life raft. With business as usual, it's not a good end. And I've based this, how we do the transition, on some key principles of steady state economics. So for those of you who don't know much about steady state economics, check the website out. But two of the key principles are: don't consume more than the planet can regenerate, and don't pollute more than the planet can safely absorb. Now, if you're not achieving either one of those two things, then you're obviously just eating away at your kids' futures. The other big thing is material throughput. So it's a little bit different to consumption, because you can have a set level of consumption, but a very different level of material throughput. So the material throughput is how much materials that your economy uses to provide certain standards of living for our populations. So obviously, if you're recycling or reusing or repairing, then your material throughput is going to be a little bit lower per set level of consumption. So I'll get to that in a little bit when I get into the steps on how we do the transition. Now, initially, as Martin alluded to with the degrowth phase, we need to reduce quite drastically on the material throughput side. Consumption, we probably only need to reduce maybe 30%, and that's very achievable. I know everyone likes to think that this is not achievable at all, but it's actually, as I go through the steps here, it is actually very achievable. We could reduce, advanced economies can reduce 30% consumption, not a problem, and it's not going to affect your standards of living that detrimentally. Material throughput, on the other hand, that has to reduce by about 70%, because we use about 1.7, 1.8 planets. At the moment, we need to reduce that one drastically. And it sounds like a huge amount, but it actually is very achievable. So let's get to it. How do we achieve it? So I've just outlaid here like a little 7-step framework to the system change we need. I've kept it pretty simple and tried to put it in a logical sequence. You know, I'm a simple individual, so I like to keep things that way. And obviously, if we're going out to the general public, and you want to get the general public on board, because let's face it, if we don't get them on board, we're done. So we've got to get the general public on board, and you've got to keep things simple. If it gets too complicated, that's just, your enemies can just destroy you with that. So the first logical step for me is a realization. I think Martin sort of touched on this as well earlier, but the general public, politicians, economists, they first need to realize that the current economic system is a dead end. It's not a good end. It's leading us to collapse. It's destroying the very foundation upon which our economy is built. And there needs to be a realization that our economy is built on our natural capital, which is, the air we breathe, water, trees, biodiversity, our climate, renewable and non-renewable resources. It's completely dependent on our natural capital. So we need that realization. We also need the realization that there is no other option. There's no other option. We have to make the transition. The second step is a purpose. I mean, if you look around the world today, there would not be many governments that you would see a clear, concise purpose for their economies. Sorry, hello?
No, someone just had their mute button off, Craig. Do continue. I've muted them.
Okay, sorry, I thought I hadn't run over time already. Jeez.
No, it wasn't me. Please continue.
All right. Yeah, a purpose. So a purpose for our economy. we obviously need a purpose for our economy. At the moment, it's just a free-for-all, and that's not a coincidence. That's so economists can be pretty much bought and paid for by the vested interests that want to get them in power to try and keep the status quo going for as long as they possibly can. So when it comes to a purpose, the purpose of our economy, it should be about serving the people. So that's not a hard sell to the general public, because obviously you want an economy to serve the people, you want it to serve us, our interests. The second one, and probably the most important one, is the economy has to operate within those planetary boundaries. Unless it operates within those planetary boundaries, it's just parasitic, it's just eating away at its future potential. So it has to operate in those planetary boundaries. Now that's the purpose. And again, you've got to keep it simple. There's no point having an A4 page sheet on the purpose of an economy. It just needs to be a couple of points like that that's easily sellable to the general public. Don't want to overcomplicate it. The next one is measurements. So you are what you measure. So obviously we need to move away from GDP growth. I mean, we could still use that figure, but we shouldn't be seen as a positive. It can be seen as a negative. As GDP grows, as the economy gets bigger, more materials, that's destroying our natural capital. So it needs to be seen as a negative. And we need to measure what matters. And what matters is people and the environment. So what are people's financial well-being? What does that look like? Are they going to be able to retire? What's their debts? What's their incomes? What's their savings? And then their health. What's their life expectancy? How many people are in poverty, especially kids? How many kids are in poverty? That ratio needs to go down. And then most important, our environment. We need to measure to see that we're getting back within those planetary boundaries. And most importantly, we need action. There's no point getting to the end of civilization and going over the cliff and looking at each other and going, geez, we measured that really well, didn't we? There's absolutely no point to that. It needs to be, it needs to lead to action. The next step is knowledge. Pretty much everything you see today, or industry and business, it all stems from the beginning, which is the knowledge sector. So this is research, technology, and innovation. So this is the next logical step in my framework. And you're going to get sick of me saying this, but everything I go through here, it has to align back to that purpose. So if a scientist is in the lab, if someone's working for a university research sector or a private company, they're developing technology, some research, the first question they have to ask is this going to make people's lives better? Is it going to reduce our material throughput? If it's not going to do either of those things, it should be shelved. Now, this is not hard to achieve because just about every piece of technology you see today, every piece of technology that you use has had government funding right from the start. They always go to government grants. It's always started with government funding. So whenever a researcher is sending a paper or research in to get funding, that person in the government should be able to look at that and say, okay, does it align back to the economic purpose? That's what they have to ask. And if it does, great, let's give them funding or at least assess it. If it doesn't, put it in the bin. There's no point. The next one is a big one. This is industry. So we move from the knowledge sector to now we're implementing it within industry. And a few, I mean, you could go for hours on this one, but let's just start with a few key points, and that is regulations need to be enforced. This is a bit like the measurements one. No point having measurements if there's no action. And here we have a regulatory environment in Australia and globally, but the regulations just aren't enforced. There's no point having all these regulations unless they're enforced. So that's a big point. And company constitutions, so I work in the ethical funds management industry part-time, and company constitutions, they need to be updated. Rather than just focusing on shareholders and short-term profits, company constitutions need to be updated to include everyone, all stakeholders. So that's employees, owners, supply chain holders, communities, environment, everyone. That's not hard to do either, because even in the US, and I think some in Europe, there's hundreds of companies that have actually updated their constitutions to include all stakeholders. So that is also very achievable. And then the specific industries themselves. So if we go through a few of them, so banking, you know, obviously there needs to be a fair bit done there, but I'd probably just talk about banking in light of they should have better terms for their lending structure, for financials, for farmers, for other sectors that are aligning their industries and sectors back to that purpose I mentioned before. So if a farmer is looking to do more regenerative farming practices, they should have better lending terms, better rates, better terms. If a company is looking to implement reduced carbon emissions, then they get better terms. So anyway, that's just one thing. There's a lot of things with banking. We haven't got enough time to go through them tonight. But education, So this is a really big one. So this is in relation to maybe economics degrees. So all economics textbooks, they should have a chapter added at the start of their textbook, which says that natural capital is the foundation of an economy. It is the most important thing of all. Any other chapter, there's no point reading forward to any other chapter. That is the most important of all. So it needs to be an upgrade of education there. Mining, obviously with mining, we don't want to mine the planet to death just in getting the green growth. So we need to be more efficient, more mindful of that. Manufacturing, this is probably the biggest one, which will help us get that material throughput down within our planetary boundaries. Manufacturing, we need to get rid of planned obsolescence. Manufacturers it needs to be mandated, it needs to be enforced that they increase their warranties by 5-fold. I've had our plasma TV for 20 odd years, so it's a pretty good warranty on that one. It's done well. Now I've said that'll probably bloody break down. But so manufacturers, you need to get rid of planned obsolescence. Products need to be made with easily replaceable parts so they can be repaired and kept for longer. Recycling, that needs to be upscaled dramatically. At the moment, it's still cheaper just to dig stuff up because we don't price the cost of extraction. So we'll either have to price the cost of extraction or we have to prop up the recycling industry more with incentives from government. So that also can be done. I think at the moment, the only thing that's viable to recycle may be hard plastics and steel and glass. That's about it. And cardboard. Farming, farmers need to be encouraged and helped along the way there with their practices so that they have less inputs, less fossil fuel inputs, less fertilizers, less chemicals, so more regenerative practices. And then obviously along the way, there'll be new industries that will need to develop. But again, the most important thing is it has to align back to the purpose. So these industries, they have to align back to making people's lives better or reducing the material throughput. The second last one, monetary and fiscal policy. Now, for those of you who don't know, monetary policy is set by reserve banks, fiscal policy is set by governments like tax and stimulus, etc. And this is quite a big one. So again, this needs to align back to the purpose of the economy. So instead of, since the global financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, there's been a massive amount of conventional monetary theory with quantitative easing, printing a whole lot of money. Now, instead of flushing all of that money, those trillions of dollars through the financial system only to reward a few Wall Street wankers, what we should be doing is flushing that money through perhaps an infrastructure bank, a natural capital bank, that then goes to industries and sectors and businesses that are there out doing their best to improve people's lives and get that material throughput down. That's where the money needs to go. So like a nature bank. And obviously we need a fairer tax system. Now we could probably talk a little bit more on this maybe in Q&A, but I'll move on because I want to get to Q&A. That's where the excitement happens. And obviously a fairer tax system, we want a better redistribution of wealth as opposed to inequality just rising and rising. Number 7, behaviour. So this comes back to us. There's a few different points here. I mean, I don't need to go through population too much because Jane did a great job of that. I might bring your attention to the top right-hand corner there. You'll see the UN statistics there in relation to women who are making a choice in relation to their decision on sex and reproductive health care. I mean, that is a pretty horrifying number. Only 57% of women around the world, aged 15 to 49, actually have a choice. So there's 43% of women, and you can be guaranteed that most of them would be in developing countries, do not have a choice at all in relation to their decisions on sex and reproductive health care. So we just need to give them choice. It's not about taking choice away, give them choice, and that'll help dramatically. The next one is to be more materialistic, and this is probably one of the biggest ones as well. And what I mean by that is not to buy more goods. I mean, love your materials more, keep them for longer. Remember I said before, we need to reduce material throughput by 70%. If you simply keep your materials by twice as long, that reduces material throughput by 50% straight away. So to get to our 70% is very, very achievable. The next one is quite a big one, a natural capital budget. So this is designed to get rid of all the rubbish offset carbon credit schemes, carbon tax incentives, all of these schemes which only exist when businesses are polluting. So they only exist by way of pollution. So a natural capital budget would get rid of all of that. It would simplify everything. You would measure it in carbon units. Every adult in an advanced economy, it would be too hard to do it in developing economies, and they don't need to do it as much. So in an advanced economy, every adult could have a natural capital budget. And if they spend over that natural capital budget, then they pay people who have gone under it. So it's also a way of distributing income a little bit more fairly between individuals as well. So those are doing good, you know, you get rewarded. Those are doing bad, don't. And that wouldn't be hard to set up because every product can be measured in carbon units. You get your serial code. You can have and everyone has a carbon card. You just swipe it, you give your number. Okay, there it is. You either pay a fine if you're going over, or maybe your marginal tax rate would go up on your highest bracket. There's a way that we could do that, and it would just simplify everything, and you wouldn't have big businesses being able to rort the system and keep polluting. Obviously, we want a better lifestyle, 4-day work week. Martin was probably talking about that in degrowth. That's what it's all about. And I think the most important thing is, which I'll finish up on, I don't know how much I've spent. I can probably do one more slide, but we need
2
to
minutes
make things...
over, Craig.
Sorry?
You're 2 minutes over. So
all right, sorry. All right.
The Q&A.
All right, I'll finish up here then. We need to make these changes within the current economic system. And that's important because if we go out there and tell people we need to change the entire system, it's just too much fear. It's going to be too scary and people just won't do it. We need to be able to do it from within this current system. And I think this 7-step framework is a way to actually do it. So, all right, I'll finish up now. Thanks, Michelle, for letting me know, because it'd be good to get into question time. I did have one more slide, but it's probably a bit depressing. So it's the hurdles to overcome, even though we have the answers. You know, the problems we've got to overcome are political systems and the vested interests, the media, and our culture of being superior or separate to nature. So we obviously need to see ourselves as part of nature and dependent on nature. And then, you know, we can maybe talk in the Q&A about the political systems and whatnot. But otherwise, I'm happy to stop sharing and answer some questions.
That'd be great. Thank you, Craig. So thank you very much, Martin, Jane, and Craig. I've just grouped some of our questions together, and thanks to everyone for popping your questions into the chat. Some great issues in there. We have a couple of questions or comments around population. We have a couple connected to degrowth, and I'm sure a couple of questions will come in about some of the specifics of Craig's suggestions. So let's start at the top. With degrowth, Michelle has asked, Martin, do we need a recession? Or does that challenge the very notion of what degrowth is?
No, recession is a failed growth economy. It's what happens when it gets the stutters. It's uncontrolled. It has nasty side effects. Degrowth is very different than a recession, but I understand why it's easy to confuse the two, but degrowth is organized and planned. A recession happens because they were just unable to keep the growth economy growing, basically, and that's virtually, you know, recession, depression, collapse is the next one beyond that. So no, we don't need a recession. We need a planned downsizing.
Thanks, Martin. A couple of questions have come through in the private links to me, asking, like, as I reflected early in the session tonight, how does steady state economics, which are excellent ideas, and particularly from Herman Daly's work in the early 70s, how do they connect with these trendy ideas around donut economics and well-being economics? Because sometimes it seems, and I'm quoting this, sometimes it seems as if the donut economics and well-being economics has forgotten previous economic models. Martin, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I'll quickly touch on that. One of the others might want to chip in as well. Look, I see donut economics primarily as a very clever branding of steady state economics. Unfortunately, with a lot of economic theory and the marketing thereof, it's handled by economists who aren't so good at putting a nice public face on their information. Kate Rayworth with Donut Economics has done an excellent job of that. And I think a lot of the other economic ideas, they're all interrelated. I guess I'd like to see a little more unity between them all. But we don't argue amongst each other. We're all on the same page. We're all trying to find that right button to push. And, you know, good luck to whoever's successful. That's how I see it.
Thanks, Martin. Now, a couple of questions on population, probably for Jane. Firstly, Michael's made a number of comments about how developing countries have been forced into really difficult situations with World Bank and IMF loans. But he says that educating women seems to be the most important aspect of all of it. Did you want to comment on that, Jane? Because I found it terrific that somebody else said, what about looking at managing male involvement in population? Would you like to touch on these issues, Jane?
Absolutely. And I think in Africa now, people are realizing that involving men is vitally important, because we're just not going to get around that patriarchal culture anytime soon. But men can come on side very strongly if they understand the issues. So there is some success happening in those areas. And on what was the first question again?
It was just about, I know, it was just about the education of women being.
Oh, education, yes.
Yeah.
So education for girls is obviously a wonderful thing. It does not particularly strongly drive fertility decline, unless there is also family planning effort and efforts to change cultural norms around family size. And in the countries that have implemented family planning programs, the lowering fertility greatly improves girls' opportunities to be at school, because they have fewer siblings to look after. Their family budgets are not so stressed that, the few school fees that they can afford are given to the boys. And they tend not to get pregnant while they're at school. So these things all help girls to complete schooling. So those correlations between girls' education and fertility are reflecting quite a strong causation in the other direction, that lowering fertility helps girls to get better educated, which is not to say we shouldn't be pushing for girls' education as best as we can, but it's not a reason for not doing family planning. It's not going to fix the population thing on its own.
So education around family planning has to be included in education.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. And because population is always such an interesting issue, there's another question, and it's an important one. One of our, I think it was Will, pointed out that there's predictions of millions of climate refugees needing to live somewhere as our planet changes. And the whole issue about needing compassion for refugees, how do we fit that into our master plans for degrowth and caring for each other in Australia? And that might be open to any of you, but Jane, did you want to start?
Yeah, okay, I'll start. It's a really difficult one because, yes, where we're heading with ecological collapse is that a lot of people are not going to be able to subsist in the place that they've been living and will be on the move. I really wish people could see that these are mostly overpopulation refugees. Climate is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back often. But usually where people are living, the population in the place they're leaving is not going down, and so they can't be evicted by climate making it less habitable for people if the number of people there is actually still increasing. So if we understood it as overpopulation refugees, and that's what's happening at the US border in Mexico, all these Central Americans moving up out of their countries that are very still have high population growth, we would frame the solutions a bit differently. And I think the solutions need to be around helping people to adapt to change in the places where they come from, more than trying to accommodate them in other countries, because having refugees come in huge numbers is very disruptive to social order and to governance, and we really won't be able to help people overseas if we're struggling to cope with the ones who arrive here. And Sweden has already twice cut foreign aid in order to provide the funds to manage the refugees that they have in their country. So these things happen.
They're tricky issues. Thanks, Jane. Craig, I've got a question here, unless you wanted to answer that one. There is a question here that might be more for you in terms of looking at banks and finance. Did you want me to jump into that, or did you want to quickly comment on climate refugees?
Yeah, well, Jane answered that one very eloquently. Well done, Jane. But I think I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic in relation to all of that, because the whole world's going to be facing refugees left, right and centre, even internally. I mean, even you look at Australia at the moment. I mean, there's regions in Australia where you just can't get house insurance. So it's like, so these people are going to be, in the future, are going to be looking for somewhere to go. So even internally, there's going to be mass displacement. Same in the US with the Midwest or the Southern West. They're running out of water. I mean, they're running out of water. There's 80 million people there. I mean, where are they going to go? It's just going to be an absolute mess worldwide. So it's not going to be just Australia that's going to have to deal with this. It's going to be a worldwide issue. So, yeah, and obviously what Jane says, the more people you've got, the more problems you're going to have, obviously. So,
yeah, and we can't solve all those problems in one webinar, but it's good to talk about those issues.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you, Craig. So, Craig, there is a question here or a comment. In all modern economies, whoever controls cash determines what gets made and what gets done. All new money is created via bank lending. On this basis, banks should be required to only lend for purposes that reduce material use, e.g. lending for housing, but with lower material use. What do you say to that, Craig?
Yeah, well, I think I covered that in my industry slide. I said that banks, they should have better terms for that. And yeah, banks, I mean, with steady state economics, you also talk about fractional reserve lending, and so they have these fractional reserve ratios. So if someone has a term deposit of 100 grand, the bank can use that and borrow another 900 to lend money into existence based on housing values, driving housing prices up. So yeah, no, I'm all for that. So it's got to be, I mean, you probably can't limit it to that, but it's got to align again back to that purpose. Like I said, as long as it's reducing material throughput or improving people's lives. So there needs to be better stipulations around that. And I suppose that opens up a broader question about, well, monetary policy and monetary theory and all of these issues. I think there was a famous joke when an economist went up to a physicist and said, that's great that it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And this is the problem we have today with economists. They operate in la la land, and they don't see that natural capital is what makes an economy function, and it limits an economy. So they just think you need capital and labour, and you can just invent money and off you go. But I think whenever you think of monetary policy, again, and I'm sure there's some modern monetary theorists in here tonight, you've still got to come back to that question. Is printing more money, or wherever you're directing that money, is it going to reduce our material throughput? Is it going to make people's lives better? Or is it just going to add to asset bubbles? Or is it going to add to hyperinflation? Is it going to destroy people's lives? So that's the question that needs to be asked. Now, if it is going to reduce material throughput and it's going to improve people's lives, all for it, let's go for it. But if it's not, that's the question it has to ask. And sometimes, people talk about that, and Jane might want to add a little bit to that.
Michelle, I was just going to chip in.
Yep.
Craig's kind of talking about debt on the margin.
Yep.
And if we talk about debt in aggregate, paying down debt is effectively cancelling money. And if that's one of our metrics of positive economic trends, that our aggregate debt levels go down, then our consumption will also be going down, because we're effectively cancelling money. So it's not about stopping giving out loans, but if, for instance, housing is not increasing, it is not inflating its price, and if we're not increasing the number of households, then the total amount owed on mortgages is going to pay down over time. So that's all beneficial in terms of facilitating degrowth.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to have to get you guys and girls back for a discussion about financial and money issues, because here in the NENA network, many of us would like to know a whole lot more about how we weave that into the work that we're doing, or what it is that we should be demanding. However, I'm grateful to everyone still being with us. We're over time, but we might chug on for 5 more minutes for those who want to stay. Got a couple more questions which we can have a chat about, and then we'll wrap up. Nikki asked a good question. Craig, this might fit into your 7 steps, or it might be a general question. She's asked, how can the shift begin to occur that would shift the workforce into work that's actually needed for supporting the practical changes we need, e.g. shifting traders into service roles? I'm not sure, I don't know which traders she means, whether that's stockbrokers. But Craig, did you want to comment on how do we, support a change in the things we do without just relying on the good old market will guide the way, because it actually won't?
Yeah. That comment about the market guiding the way it's an interesting one, because governments don't believe in it anyway. So they're always intervening in markets and propping up, their buddies and what they need to do and give them the regulations they need. But yeah, I think again, it comes probably back to that first step. Like, there's no way we're going to get anything happening unless we get a realization that the current system is just not going to lead us into a good place. It's just leading us to an unavoidable, painful, miserable collapse. So I think for me, that's the first step. And then once you implement those other steps in the knowledge sector, then everything flows from the knowledge sector. Then the governments can allocate funds to, okay, well, then how do we facilitate the technology from that knowledge sector to industry? So you might need infrastructure for that. So obviously the renewable transition at the moment, that's probably a decent example. So there's a lot of problems in the grid infrastructure in relation to handling renewables and intermittent renewables. I mean, it's not really well known that there's a lot of problems, but there needs to be a lot of money spent on the infrastructure to be able to handle the intermittent renewables, and there needs to be a lot of storage in place. So in that sector, because the grid struggles with inertia and firming and all of these frequency ancillary services that are required to keep everything going. So I think like that needs to happen. So it starts from the realization, and then the measurements as well we need. So yeah, I mean, those steps sort of logically sort of spell it out to a degree. So before you get to workers, I mean, you've got to have that knowledge sector, and then the government implementing the regulations or the incentives for the industries. So it has to come, for me, it has to come from the top down. But like Martin and I have interesting conversations on this. Like, I think it has to be top down, but to get the top down happening, you also need an awareness from the bottom up to get the top to do their job, basically. So I don't know if anyone else wants to pipe in on that.
Well, that's a big issue about scale, isn't it? Which I'd really love to talk about at a future webinar. Like, where do we start and how do we do this? Because many of the steps you've talked about, Craig, some of them are regulatory, meaning we need governments to pass laws, and getting that to happen is challenging. We've seen that on everything from the right to repair to other good things, many other good things. There's actually one final question I'm going to throw at everybody, and then we'll have to wrap it up. And I note that Robert has asked me a question privately, but I won't mention who he is. He says that many of the approaches that everyone is talking about seem to be really human-centered. Where is the truth around the foundations of life? And we know that it is the essence of steady state economics. But did you want to talk a little bit more about, because I've actually got another private question about, surely the use of the terms natural capital are very 1990s. Natural capital is no longer what people want to talk about when we are trying to say that nature is a whole lot more than just capital. So shall we put our ecocentric hats on just for a moment? And yes, please, Craig.
Yeah, I use the term natural capital because environment and sustainability are bad words. Like, if you go to
this crew.
No, exactly. Well, that's the problem. So if you go to the mainstream public or try and get traction in the mainstream media and you mention environment, they're like, oh, bloody tree huggers. Or if you get, so you can't, so I like to use the word natural capital because it speaks in the same language that capitalists are speaking to a degree, but it's getting us back to talking about nature. Because I think once you talk about environment, they just slap you down straight away. Like, you just can't beat them.
It certainly depends on the audience, doesn't it? Because there are others who like the ESG framing, and it just goes on and on. Jane or Martin, just as some final comments, did you want to put your ecocentric hat on and think about how all of these issues connect with Mother Earth?
Yes, absolutely. It's really important to keep bringing that ecocentric perspective back into the discussion. But the vision is for humanity to live in balance with the natural environment in ways that don't displace other species more than they already have been. Obviously, we can't have even several billion people on the planet without displacing other species to some extent. But the pathway to get there needs to be one that doesn't jettison a whole lot of people and their welfare. So we need to have anthropocentric perspectives around the social well-being and the nurturing of people on that transition to sustainability. So, it is really important to engage economists in their own language, and it's very hard to incorporate a meaningful ecological perspective there, because, the inherent value of nature by definition can't be put into dollar terms and can't fit into those models. So we just have to play these two games at the same time.
Thanks, Jane. And Martin, did you want to comment on that one? And you are on mute, but that.
Right,
Yeah.
now I'm good. Yeah, look, pretty much what Jane has just said. It's a moral and ethical question which underpins degrowth, steady state, and the new economy ideas. Is part of that is very much people caring for nature and understanding that other life has rights of their own. They don't need to justify it in human economic terms. They have a right to exist. And part of shrinking the scale of the human economy is about giving back to other life, creating space so that they too can have a life on this planet. And I think everybody in this movement, probably everybody in this webinar tonight, feels that deeply in their core, and that's what motivates people greatly in pursuing this quest, I think.
Excellent. And it's really good to hear the three of you talking about these challenges of, the language we have to use in different audiences, making sure that people are engaged enough to care about the future of other species, and knowing, as Martin said, that all of these issues are resting on the foundations of the living world. So look, we will wrap up, and it's lovely that everyone has stayed on for the extra 15 minutes. I really can't thank our panelists enough. Craig, Jane and Martin, thanks so much for giving up your time on a lovely summer's evening and sharing your thoughts with us. We'd love to have you come back. We'll be hosting lots of other workshops and discussions this year, hopefully the Ecological Economics Hub inside NENA might be able to put some great sessions together for our conference too when we all get together. And finally, I'm going to give a plug for a project that Ayla and NENA have been heavily invested in for many years, which is Greenprints. This is literally how local communities and councils and other interested businesses and folks can weave together the full story of whether you call it regenerative everything or nested sustainability or ecological economics or just caring for country. Greenprints is now being engaged with groups like the Lithgow Transformation Hub and many other community groups around the place. So if you're interested in how people can take those early steps, how you can link it at the local scale, and how you can connect up with so many other groups doing wonderful things, do get in touch, have a look at the website. But on that note, thank you so much again to our panelists, and I look forward to seeing you all again. And thank you to everyone who's been with us tonight. I hope we covered most of the questions. There were a few coming in that we didn't quite get to, but stay tuned. If you're not already on the NENA email list, please check out neweconomy.org.au and you'll be invited to further fun-filled activities and adventures. So thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.